The stories. This audio recorder captured the last known conversation. Rhea Calder was 34 years old and worked as a digital evidence technician when an overlooked recorder reached her department without explanation. The recorder arrived inside a sealed evidence pouch that carried faded labels from 2009 and several unreadable signatures. According to archived inventory notes, the device had been misplaced during a storage transfer before quietly returning years later. Nobody expected the recorder to contain anything important because earlier reports claimed the battery had completely failed before investigators examined it. Rhea handled forgotten electronics almost every week, and her assignment usually ended after confirming damaged files could not be recovered. That morning seemed ordinary until she noticed fresh scratches around the recorder battery cover that looked newer than everything else. The scratches suggested someone had opened the compartment after the original investigation ended, which immediately caught her careful attention. She photographed every angle before touching anything because department rules demanded complete documentation before any recovery attempt began. The recorder accepted replacement power without trouble, which surprised everyone because corrosion usually destroyed electronics left untouched for many years. Its small screen flickered slowly before showing one surviving recording that lasted slightly longer than 23 minutes. The original case involved a maintenance worker who reportedly vanished after finishing repairs inside an abandoned municipal storage building. Witness statements described nothing violent, and dispatch logs recorded only a routine missing person report filed later that evening. Search teams covered nearby roads and surrounding woodland, but found only abandoned tools beside an unlocked service entrance. The missing worker never returned, and investigators eventually suspended active searches after every practical lead disappeared without results. Earlier evidence summaries mentioned an audio recorder carried for maintenance inspections because spoken notes saved valuable paperwork during long shifts. Everyone believed those recordings had disappeared after the damaged battery leaked inside the compartment during evidence storage. Rhea connected the recorder through approved recovery equipment before creating several duplicate copies that preserved every remaining digital fragment. She never listened directly from original media because department policy required untouched evidence whenever restoration remained possible. The recovered file opened with ordinary background sounds that matched maintenance work inside a large concrete building during daylight hours. Metal footsteps echoed softly, while distant ventilation fans produced a constant humming sound beneath every spoken word. A calm male voice described electrical panels needing replacement before reading serial numbers that matched old maintenance records exactly. Everything sounded routine until another unfamiliar voice quietly answered from somewhere farther down the empty hallway. The second voice sounded calm instead of threatening, which immediately confused everyone reviewing the restored recording together. The maintenance worker stopped speaking for several seconds before asking who remained inside after closing time. No reply came immediately, but faint footsteps continued approaching with slow, measured movement across the concrete floor. Rhea adjusted filtering software carefully because excessive enhancement sometimes created misleading sounds that never existed within original recordings. The cleaned version confirmed footsteps without adding artificial details, which strengthened confidence in every documented observation. Several coworkers listened independently, and each described hearing identical movement before the unknown speaker answered again. The second voice quietly mentioned checking another electrical room, although building schedules showed nobody else assigned that afternoon. Personnel records confirmed every scheduled employee signed out nearly 40 minutes before the missing worker stopped answering radio calls. That contradiction immediately pushed supervisors toward reopening forgotten evidence because the recovered conversation challenged accepted timelines. Rhea requested archived building access records stored inside municipal backups that few employees remembered still existed. Older database files survived despite outdated software because annual transfers preserved historical records for liability purposes. The electronic logs revealed something unexpected after technicians finally converted obsolete formats into readable modern documents. An access card opened the rear service entrance less than 15 minutes before the recorder captured unfamiliar footsteps. Investigators originally ignored that entry because software corruption displayed incomplete identification during the first review years earlier. Modern recovery methods restored enough missing characters to reveal the access card belonged to a contract supervisor. The supervisor had retired shortly after the disappearance and reportedly moved across the country several years later. Old interview notes showed detectives questioned him briefly before accepting his explanation without finding contradictory evidence. His statement claimed he left before the maintenance worker arrived, which matched corrupted access records available during the original investigation. The restored entry proved his card activated the building after everyone believed he had already departed. Supervisors tracked retired employment files before locating a forwarding address preserved inside pension administration records. Detectives requested a voluntary interview, and the retired supervisor agreed without legal objections or unusual conditions. He appeared genuinely surprised when investigators mentioned the restored recorder because he believed every recording had been destroyed. During the interview, he admitted entering through the rear entrance after realizing he forgot expensive inspection equipment. He insisted nobody greeted him because he hurried inside before immediately collecting a storage case near the mechanical room. He remembered hearing another person talking somewhere beyond the hallway, although he assumed routine maintenance continued nearby. He never reported returning because nobody asked whether forgotten equipment required another brief building entry that afternoon. His explanation accounted for the access card, but failed to explain why the recorder captured conversation instead of distant background noise. RIA examined building diagrams preserved inside engineering archives before comparing every hallway with the recovered audio. She noticed one narrow inspection corridor created unusual echoes that carried voices much farther than expected. Acoustic testing inside a similar structure produced remarkably close sound patterns when speakers remained separated by several connected passageways. That discovery explained why the second voice sounded nearby, despite likely standing much farther inside the building. Investigators returned using updated floor plans unavailable during the original search conducted many years before. They discovered sealed renovation walls concealed an older service shaft omitted from newer emergency diagrams. Construction records revealed contractors permanently closed the shaft after asbestos removal several years before the disappearance. However, one temporary barrier installed during renovations never appeared inside final documentation reviewed by emergency responders. Ground-penetrating inspection equipment located an empty maintenance cavity beyond that forgotten temporary barrier inside the older structure. The space contained discarded equipment and weather-damaged paperwork overlooked since renovation crews completed their final inspections. Among those items, investigators recovered the missing worker's identification badge buried beneath collapsed insulation and broken storage panels. Forensic examination indicated the badge reached that location during renovation activity instead of deliberate concealment by another person. Additional inspection revealed unstable flooring near the hidden cavity where loose support material had failed unexpectedly years earlier. Engineers concluded someone stepping onto weakened boards could easily fall into the isolated maintenance space without immediate detection. The cavity connected poorly with occupied sections because thick concrete absorbed sound, while ventilation fans masked distant calls for help. RIA listened again to the final minutes after learning about the hidden cavity discovered behind forgotten renovation barriers. The recording suddenly made much more sense than it had during every previous review session. The maintenance worker thanked the unknown person before walking toward another electrical room mentioned moments earlier during routine inspection notes. His footsteps changed rhythm after crossing uneven flooring that investigators later matched with damaged structural supports. A sharp impact interrupted his sentence before loose debris crashed loudly across the recorder microphone. The device continued recording while muffled breathing echoed beneath heavy concrete and running ventilation equipment. The unknown voice called repeatedly from somewhere above, although responses grew increasingly faint beneath surrounding structural noise. Eventually, the second speaker hurried away while apparently searching for another entrance into the confusing service corridors. Dispatch logs confirmed an emergency call arrived later from outside the building after someone reported hearing unusual crashing sounds. Responding officers searched accessible rooms, but outdated renovation drawings prevented anyone from finding the concealed maintenance cavity. The retired supervisor likely became that unidentified caller, although incomplete records never preserved his original emergency statement. Telephone archives contained only partial metadata because recording systems automatically erased routine calls after several years. Even without every answer, the combined evidence created a believable sequence that fits surviving records without unnecessary speculation. The recovered recorder never exposed criminal violence or secret conspiracies, despite countless rumors spreading through local conversations. Instead, it revealed how ordinary mistakes slowly stacked together until one preventable accident disappeared behind missing paperwork and flawed building records. The final conversation survived only because the recorder landed beneath debris that protected delicate memory components from complete destruction. Its damaged battery convinced everyone the recordings vanished forever, which delayed meaningful recovery for many years. Rhea completed her final evidence report using careful language supported by restored files and verified engineering conclusions. She avoided dramatic claims because every documented fact already carried enough quiet weight without exaggeration. Department supervisors officially updated the historical case after reviewing recovered audio and newly discovered structural evidence together. Family representatives finally received a clearer explanation supported by physical findings instead of unanswered assumptions that lingered for years. The recorder returned to secure storage after preservation specialists finished creating verified archival copies for future reference. Visitors passing evidence shelves would never guess one small forgotten device quietly changed the understanding of an old disappearance. Sometimes the strongest answer never arrives through dramatic revelations, but through patient work that finally lets overlooked facts speak clearly. The stories. Why the empty observation deck was sealed without explanation. The observation deck closed without any public explanation after one quiet afternoon changed everything for the small maintenance crew. Archived inspection notes and staff interviews later suggested the reason had never been as simple as an ordinary safety concern. Rylan Mercer was 38 years old and worked as a structural maintenance supervisor for a regional parks department. His assignment covered several scenic overlooks scattered across forested hills near an unnamed reservoir. Most days involved replacing worn railings, inspecting concrete, and documenting weather damage before visitors ever noticed small problems. The observation deck stood on a ridge above the water where photographers gathered during sunrise and families stopped during weekend drives. It had remained unchanged for nearly 30 years and rarely caused serious maintenance concerns. Local employees often described it as the easiest location on their inspection schedule. One cloudy morning during early autumn, Rylan arrived expecting another routine inspection before reopening the deck for the weekend. The overnight weather had been calm, and dispatch records reported no emergency calls from the surrounding trails. Everything suggested the visit would finish before lunch without unexpected delays. His partner that morning was Kiera Holt, a 41-year-old civil engineering technician responsible for documenting inspection measurements. She had worked with Rylan for almost 6 years and trusted his instincts whenever unusual structural patterns appeared during inspections. Their teamwork rarely required many words because each understood the other's routine perfectly. After unlocking the access gate, both noticed something unusual before reaching the observation platform itself. Every trash bin remained empty despite several visitors reportedly stopping there the previous evening, according to parking records. The wooden walkway also appeared strangely clean after recent windy conditions covered nearby trails with fallen leaves. Kiera paused beside the entrance and quietly said, "Something feels different today." Rylan looked across the platform and simply nodded before continuing toward the center with his inspection clipboard. Nothing looked damaged from a distance, yet something about the silence felt difficult to ignore. Normally, birds nested along nearby trees and squirrels crossed the railing, searching for dropped food from visitors throughout every season. That morning, the surrounding woods remained strangely quiet, despite perfect weather and comfortable temperatures. Even the water below reflected almost perfectly without noticeable movement across its broad surface. Rylan began documenting railing bolts while Kiera measured small expansion joints near the concrete foundation. Everything appeared well within acceptable standards until she noticed several narrow cracks beneath one corner support. They were too straight to resemble ordinary weather damage and seemed unusually fresh compared with surrounding concrete. She photographed each crack carefully before calling Rylan across the platform for another opinion. He examined the surface closely and noticed fine gray dust collecting around every opening. The material looked freshly disturbed despite no recorded construction or seismic activity anywhere nearby during recent months. Their inspection continued underneath the observation deck where steel support beams anchored into reinforced concrete footings. Flashlight beams revealed no immediate corrosion, yet one beam carried faint scrape marks extending several feet upward. Those marks looked recent because exposed metal still reflected bright silver beneath protective paint. Neither inspector could explain how equipment heavy enough to create those scratches reached such an isolated location. The maintenance road ended nearly half a mile away, and no vehicle tracks appeared anywhere nearby. Even portable machinery would have required several workers, and official scheduling records showed nothing unusual. Rylan contacted the regional office requesting previous inspection photographs for comparison before making any conclusions. The archived images arrived through internal records less than an hour later. Every photograph taken during the previous inspection showed perfectly smooth concrete beneath the same support beam without visible cracking. Kiera compared timestamps carefully and confirmed nothing had been altered within the digital files. She quietly pointed toward one overlooked detail hidden within an older photograph. A maintenance toolbox appeared sitting beside the support beam despite no toolbox being listed in inventory reports from that inspection. The missing toolbox puzzled everyone because maintenance equipment rarely disappeared without extensive paperwork and replacement requests. Dispatch supervisors searched storage records but found nothing explaining where the equipment eventually went. The employee assigned that inspection had retired several years earlier after transferring to another department. Rylan requested archived paper notes stored inside regional maintenance offices because digital records sometimes omitted handwritten observations. Several hours later, an administrative clerk located the original inspection folder from nearly a decade earlier. Most pages contained ordinary measurements until one final sheet appeared folded behind the inspection checklist. The final page described repeated vibration beneath the observation deck during completely calm weather. The inspector reported hearing faint metallic sounds beneath the platform, although no visible movement accompanied those strange noises. Someone later crossed out several lines using thick black marker before filing the report. No explanation accompanied those edits, and no supervisor signature approved the changes afterward. Kiera found that omission especially unusual because maintenance documentation followed strict review procedures across every department. Missing authorization almost never happened without someone eventually correcting the paperwork. Later that afternoon, they interviewed a retired groundskeeper named Orson Vale, who occasionally visited former coworkers nearby. He remembered hearing rumors about unexplained maintenance delays many years before retirement. According to his memory, several inspections had been quietly postponed without informing regular visitors. Orson hesitated before mentioning one detail that always bothered him after leaving the department. During one inspection years earlier, every worker received instructions preventing anyone from remaining beneath the deck after sunset. No written explanation ever accompanied those unusual scheduling changes, despite repeated questions from experienced employees. He finally admitted someone once discovered an empty camera resting underneath the observation platform after closing hours. The film inside reportedly contained ordinary landscape photographs until the final frame appeared unexpectedly blurred. That last image showed nothing recognizable except several bright lines crossing beneath the platform. Rylan located the archived evidence receipt describing recovery of the forgotten camera from maintenance storage. Surprisingly, the camera itself still remained sealed inside an evidence cabinet because nobody ever claimed ownership. Permission arrived the following morning, allowing both inspectors to examine the recovered item carefully. The camera showed years of dust but remained otherwise untouched since being cataloged decades earlier. Inside the storage envelope rested developed photographs matching the archive description almost perfectly. Every landscape image looked completely ordinary until the final photograph interrupted the peaceful sequence. The last frame displayed the underside of the observation deck from an unusually low angle near the support beams. Bright streaks crossed through the image, although they did not resemble ordinary camera defects or reflected sunlight. One support beam also appeared slightly displaced compared with current inspection photographs. Kiera compared the old photograph against measurements collected during their inspection the previous day. She realized the beam had slowly shifted only a few centimeters across many years. That movement remained too gradual for visitors to notice, yet significant enough for structural engineers to investigate further. Regional engineers soon arrived carrying specialized monitoring equipment designed to measure tiny structural movement beneath large public platforms. Initial readings surprised everyone because one support foundation continued moving almost imperceptibly under normal environmental conditions. The motion remained extremely slow, yet continued even after temperature changes stabilized. Further drilling around the foundation uncovered something nobody expected beneath the reinforced concrete footings. Long-abandoned utility tunnels crossed directly beneath one section of the observation deck according to forgotten construction maps. Those tunnels never appeared within modern maintenance records because later renovations accidentally omitted them. The original builders had reportedly sealed those passages decades earlier after changing construction plans during the final project phase. Unfortunately, incomplete documentation allowed later maintenance crews to forget the tunnels existed entirely. Gradual erosion beneath one sealed passage weakened surrounding soil over many decades without visible warning signs. That discovery explained the mysterious vibration reported years before by retired inspectors who sensed movement during otherwise calm weather. Tiny shifts inside, collapsing underground spaces, occasionally transferred upward through steel supports into the observation deck. The sounds never occurred consistently enough for anyone to identify their true source. Investigators eventually connected every overlooked clue collected across different decades into one logical sequence. The fresh concrete cracks reflected recent underground movement rather than sudden structural failure. The bright scrape marks appeared because one support beam shifted slowly against nearby reinforcement plates during countless unnoticed adjustments. Even the missing toolbox finally received a believable explanation through archived payroll records and handwritten maintenance notes. The retired inspector accidentally dropped it into an unfinished service opening while investigating unusual vibrations years earlier. That opening disappeared beneath later repair work before anyone realized equipment remained trapped below. Engineers concluded the observation deck still appeared outwardly safe during ordinary visits, but required complete closure until extensive stabilization work finished. Officials avoided releasing detailed explanations while technical studies continued because incomplete information often created unnecessary public speculation. Visitors simply found locked gates, accompanied by temporary closure notices without additional details. Months later, construction crews carefully dismantled sections of the platform before reinforcing the weakened underground passages with modern support systems. Most visitors assumed ordinary renovation work explained the extended closure. Very few people realized forgotten decisions from decades earlier nearly allowed a slow underground collapse to continue unnoticed. When the observation deck finally reopened, almost every visible feature looked exactly as it had before construction began. Fresh paint, covered reinforced railings, and new concrete blended perfectly with older surfaces. Nothing obvious suggested complicated engineering work now rested beneath the familiar scenic overlook. Ryland later stored every photograph, inspection report, and interview transcript inside updated maintenance archives where future inspectors could easily locate them. He insisted every unusual observation deserved careful documentation, even when immediate answers seemed impossible. Quiet details often became important years later after enough evidence finally connected scattered pieces together. The sealed observation deck never hid anything supernatural, despite years of local rumors and whispered stories among longtime visitors. It concealed something much more believable and ultimately more unsettling. Small, overlooked records nearly allowed an invisible structural problem to remain hidden until ordinary maintenance finally uncovered the complete truth. The stories. What was hidden behind this locked Firewatch tower? The old Firewatch tower stayed locked for nearly 3 decades, even after every nearby trail reopened without restrictions. Archived maintenance records reportedly showed regular inspections, yet nobody admitted climbing the stairs after 1997. Ronan Voss was 38 years old and worked as a regional forestry surveyor who spent most weekdays checking aging structures across public land. He had inspected abandoned cabins and damaged bridges before, yet the forgotten tower remained the only assignment carrying unusual instructions from supervisors. The paperwork simply noted that exterior conditions should be documented, while interior access remained prohibited until further authorization arrived. Nobody explained why those restrictions still existed after so many quiet years. The tower stood above a thick forest several hours from the nearest town, where only scattered hikers occasionally passed through during warmer months. Wind pushed through tall pine trees almost every afternoon, while birds circled the ridge without much disturbance from visitors. Rust covered the steel staircase, and faded warning signs leaned sideways near cracked concrete footings. Even from the parking area, the place looked forgotten rather than dangerous. Ronan expected another routine inspection before moving toward his next assignment later that afternoon. He photographed loose railings and broken windows while recording notes into a handheld recorder carried during every survey. Everything matched decades of weather exposure except one detail that immediately felt out of place. Fresh grease covered the padlock, securing the entrance door despite obvious corrosion across every surrounding metal surface. He stepped closer and noticed faint boot prints pressed into damp soil beneath the staircase. Recent rain had softened the ground overnight, and those marks looked no older than several days. The prints stopped beneath the tower without showing any clear return path toward the nearby trail. Ronan quietly photographed every impression before measuring each one beside a folding ruler carried inside his equipment bag. Back inside his truck, he reviewed previous inspection files stored on an office tablet. Earlier, reports mentioned cracked support beams and peeling paint, but never referenced fresh maintenance around the entrance lock. Every photograph from earlier years showed heavy rust covering the same padlock, now shining beneath new lubricant. Someone had visited recently without documenting their presence. He contacted the regional office and requested clarification regarding the unexpected maintenance. The administrator searched digital files before answering, with noticeable hesitation through the radio connection. She confirmed nobody currently employed had authorized work around the abandoned structure. Older paper records remained stored inside an archive warehouse several counties away and had never been fully digitized. Because daylight remained plentiful, Ronan received permission to continue documenting only exterior conditions until additional information arrived. He circled the tower, searching for signs of forced entry or vandalism hidden beneath dense vegetation. Behind the northern support columns, he discovered several cigarette filters that appeared surprisingly fresh despite frequent rainfall washing debris downhill. Nearby branches had been trimmed recently with clean cuts instead of natural breaks. A retired volunteer ranger named Ellis Farrow lived near the access road and remembered working lookout shifts during 1996 before funding disappeared. Ronan visited the modest cabin, hoping forgotten memories might explain the strange inspection restrictions surrounding the abandoned tower. Ellis welcomed him inside after hearing the location mentioned and quietly stared toward the window for several long moments. The older man admitted nobody discussed that tower anymore because conversations always ended with uncomfortable disagreements between former employees. He insisted no supernatural stories belonged there, despite rumors spreading through nearby towns over many years. Instead, he recalled a severe wildfire exercise during late autumn that unexpectedly shifted into something completely different. Dispatch crews reportedly received repeated emergency calls claiming smoke surrounded distant hills where no active fires existed. Several lookout operators confirmed unusual haze through binoculars, while ground teams found perfectly clear weather upon arrival. Investigators blamed faulty atmospheric conditions before quietly closing every internal report within several weeks. Ellis never believed that explanation because radio recordings reportedly disappeared before official reviews concluded. Ronan asked whether anyone vanished during those confusing operations. Ellis slowly shook his head before correcting himself with visible uncertainty. Nobody officially disappeared, according to public reports, but one contract technician resigned immediately afterward and refused every request for interviews. The technician packed belongings overnight and reportedly moved across the country without collecting final payments. Those memories pushed Ronan toward the archive warehouse the following morning after receiving temporary approval for additional research. Dust-covered rows of aging storage boxes containing handwritten inspection logs and faded maintenance receipts dating across several decades. One damaged folder carried the abandoned tower identification number written across its front cover with dark fading ink. Inside the folder, Ronan found ordinary maintenance notes until reaching several missing pages carefully removed without damaging nearby paper. Remaining documents referenced replacement radio equipment delivered during 1997, only weeks before permanent closure. Attached receipts confirmed expensive communication hardware arrived despite budget reductions affecting every surrounding lookout station. That purchase made little financial sense before immediate abandonment. An elderly records clerk remembered processing those invoices while working temporary office shifts during that period. She recalled confusion because shipment documents required unusual signatures from multiple agencies instead of ordinary forestry supervisors. Nobody explained the added oversight, and employees simply followed instructions without asking unnecessary questions. Years later, she still remembered those forms because nothing similar appeared again. Returning to the tower, Ronan noticed another vehicle parked beside the empty trailhead despite weekday isolation. A gray pickup slowly pulled away before he reached the entrance and disappeared along the narrow gravel road. He photographed the departing vehicle from a distance, though the license plate remained impossible to identify clearly. Fresh tire tracks stayed visible across damp gravel after the truck vanished beyond nearby hills. Local deputies agreed to note the suspicious activity, although no immediate crime had occurred. One deputy mentioned receiving occasional reports about vehicles lingering near the abandoned lookout during hunting season. Officers never discovered trespassers because callers always reported sightings hours after unfamiliar vehicles disappeared. The pattern seemed strange, but never serious enough for deeper investigation. Several days later, authorization finally arrived, allowing supervised entry after structural engineers confirmed the staircase remained stable enough for careful inspection. Ronan climbed slowly while documenting every landing because weakened steel groaned beneath each measured step. Dust-coated windows inside the observation room, yet several surfaces appeared recently, wiped completely clean. Someone had definitely entered despite decades of official restrictions. The interior contained old desks and faded maps, exactly where earlier photographs placed them many years before. Broken radio equipment rested inside cabinets, while weather damage marked most wooden furniture beyond practical repair. Nothing suggested valuable property remained until Ronan noticed slight scratches surrounding a narrow storage wall behind filing shelves. Closer inspection revealed hidden hinges blending almost perfectly with weathered wooden panels. The concealed section opened only after removing several rusted screws already loosened by previous unknown visitors. Behind that wall stood a cramped maintenance compartment absent from every surviving floor plan recovered through archive records. Dust patterns suggested repeated access despite years of supposed abandonment. Inside the compartment rested waterproof containers holding real recordings and handwritten communication transcripts carefully sealed against moisture. Every label carried dates from the final operational month before closure during 1997. Ronan immediately contacted supervisors rather than opening anything without official witnesses present. The discovery exceeded ordinary maintenance responsibilities and required documented chain of custody. Investigators later examined every recovered recording using restored playback equipment inside a regional evidence laboratory. Most conversations covered routine weather observations and equipment testing across neighboring lookout stations without remarkable findings. Then, one recording captured repeated interference, followed by voices discussing unauthorized radio frequencies, interrupting emergency communications across multiple districts. Operators sounded confused rather than frightened throughout those exchanges. Handwritten notes matched the recordings with surprising consistency. Several technicians believed experimental communication equipment installed nearby accidentally overwhelmed existing emergency systems during specific atmospheric conditions. Instead of admitting technical failures across overlapping agencies, officials reportedly suspended operations while quietly removing sensitive hardware from service. Closing the tower proved simpler than explaining expensive mistakes involving public safety infrastructure. Additional engineering files eventually confirmed hidden cable conduits once connected specialized transmitters beneath the tower foundation. Those components had been removed years earlier, although concealed storage containing operational records remained overlooked behind the false maintenance wall. Nobody intentionally protected supernatural secrets because ordinary bureaucratic confusion buried forgotten evidence beneath decades of incomplete documentation. Missing paperwork allowed rumors to replace boring reality. The mysterious maintenance around the entrance finally received a practical explanation through witness interviews conducted after Ronan reported recent activity. A retired subcontractor admitted privately checking the padlock every few months because guilt followed him throughout retirement. He feared someone might accidentally uncover overlooked government property before proper authorities recovered remaining documentation. Embarrassment kept him silent long after responsibility should have transferred elsewhere. Investigators found no evidence supporting criminal conspiracies or hidden treasure, despite endless local stories surrounding the abandoned lookout. They uncovered forgotten records showing poor communication between agencies and repeated assumptions that another department handled unfinished responsibilities. Small mistakes slowly became permanent habits until nobody remembered original decisions with complete certainty. The locked tower quietly remained untouched because everyone believed someone else understood its history. Months later, the recovered recordings entered public archives after sensitive technical references received appropriate review. Historians considered the discovery valuable because it documented how simple administrative failures created lasting legends around abandoned public structures. Visitors eventually returned after restoration crews repaired damaged stairs and installed informational displays describing verified historical events. Rumors gradually faded once ordinary facts became easier to access. The old Firewatch Tower still overlooks the forest every season, with the same silent view stretching across distant hills and winding trails. Most visitors now expect dramatic secrets hidden inside those weathered walls before reading carefully preserved records displayed near the entrance. They usually leave surprised because the greatest mystery was never hidden behind the locked door. It survived through forgotten paperwork and quiet assumptions that lasted far longer than anyone expected. The stories. The ferry dock where everyone remembered the wrong night. The ferry dock became part of local folklore because nearly every witness remembered the same terrifying night. Archived records later suggested those memories belonged to an entirely different evening. Neria Holt was 38 years old and worked as a regional insurance investigator handling property claims after storms and accidents. She spent most weekdays visiting damaged buildings before comparing witness accounts against maintenance records and old photographs. During late autumn in 2018, she received a routine assignment involving repeated damage claims at an aging ferry dock along a quiet stretch of coastline. The owner insisted another mysterious accident had frightened away customers despite finding almost no physical evidence after each reported event. The assignment looked ordinary until Neria noticed every statement described one unforgettable night with remarkable confidence and matching details. Each witness claimed heavy rain covered the harbor, while emergency lights reflected across rough water and frightened passengers crowded the loading ramp. According to every interview, the ferry never left because someone screamed about a missing child moments before departure. Local conversation treated that account like accepted history because nobody questioned memories repeated across many years by trusted neighbors. Neria arrived shortly after sunrise while maintenance workers replaced loose boards damaged by ordinary winter weather and steady salt exposure. The harbor remained quiet because tourist traffic had almost disappeared before colder temperatures settled across the surrounding fishing communities. She photographed every damaged section before reviewing repair invoices stored inside a cramped office overlooking the water. The paperwork seemed organized, although several years contained unusual gaps where inspection reports should normally have appeared. The dock manager introduced himself as Lyle Voss and explained the missing paperwork disappeared after an office flood several winters earlier. His explanation sounded reasonable, although insurance files confirmed no flood claim ever reached regional records during that period. Neria quietly noted the inconsistency before asking about the famous night every resident seemed eager to discuss. Lyle repeated the familiar version without hesitation and described pounding rain with flashing lights and desperate voices calling toward dark water. He spoke carefully, although certain details changed whenever Neria requested exact times or specific people standing nearby that evening. His confidence remained strong while his timeline drifted several minutes forward during every repeated explanation. Experienced investigators recognized that pattern because genuine memories usually held steady even after many years had passed. Stories repeated often could become polished while losing small, truthful details hidden beneath confident retelling. After leaving the office, Neria walked along the shoreline, speaking with retired fishermen, repairing old nets beside weathered storage sheds. Every conversation produced nearly identical descriptions, despite coming from people who rarely agreed about anything else around the harbor. They remembered cold rain, soaking jackets, while frightened families searched beneath parked vehicles and empty benches for one missing youngster. Nobody could explain what happened after police supposedly arrived because every memory became strangely uncertain beyond that dramatic moment. That evening, Neria reviewed archived newspaper copies preserved inside the county library several miles inland from the ferry terminal. She expected dramatic front-page coverage describing a missing child and emergency response involving dozens of frightened passengers. Instead, every newspaper from that week focused on ordinary weather forecasts and routine council meetings without mentioning the supposed emergency. She requested older editions covering nearby months before discovering one article describing heavy rain and temporary ferry delays during another year. The article belonged to 2011 rather than 2015, which every witness confidently mentioned during interviews. It described a frightened family reporting their young son missing shortly before a scheduled departure across the narrow channel. Harbor staff quickly found the child asleep beneath stacked life jackets inside a waiting shelter before the ferry departed safely. The event lasted barely 20 minutes and caused little lasting disruption beyond anxious conversations during following weeks. Neria compared every witness statement against the article before noticing several matching phrases repeated almost word for word throughout recent interviews. Those exact descriptions appeared inside the old newspaper because one local reporter quoted harbor workers immediately after the harmless incident ended. Somehow, almost everyone believed the event happened several years later during another season entirely, despite clear printed evidence proving otherwise. Curious about the confusion, Neria visited the local historical society where volunteers stored photographs donated by longtime residents over many decades. One volunteer, named Corin Bale, managed thousands of labeled negatives inside carefully organized cabinets protected from moisture and fading sunlight. Corin welcomed researchers because few visitors cared about forgotten harbor history beyond occasional school projects and family genealogy searches. He immediately recognized the dock from Neria's photographs before retrieving several boxes covering different renovation periods. Among faded prints, she discovered images showing temporary flood barriers installed around the office during 2015 after unusually high tides. Those barriers explained why many residents later believed serious flooding damaged office files, although actual water never entered the building. Maintenance crews erected the barriers before storms arrived and removed them after tides receded without significant property damage. The visual memory remained powerful because dramatic preparations often overshadowed uneventful outcomes inside ordinary recollections. Another photograph showed emergency vehicles parked near the dock during an evening charity safety demonstration held several months after the missing child incident. Volunteers practiced evacuation procedures using flashing lights, while local families watched from nearby parking areas before returning home. No genuine emergency occurred, although the demonstration looked convincing in photographs taken from certain angles across the harbor. Neria suddenly wondered whether separate memories had quietly merged through years of repeated storytelling. She requested archived dispatch recordings covering both evenings from the Regional Emergency Communications Office, storing historical public records. The recordings confirmed officers responded briefly during 2011 because worried parents reported their missing son before locating him safely. Another recording from 2015 documented traffic assistance during the planned safety demonstration without mentioning frightened passengers or missing children. Each recording remained ordinary alone, although together they perfectly matched the blended story repeated throughout the harbor. Neria returned the next morning and interviewed several witnesses again without revealing what archived materials already suggested about the famous night. Instead, she asked everyone where they first heard the complete version after many years passed since the supposed emergency. Most admitted they discussed the event during annual harbor festivals while viewing historical photographs displayed beside food stalls and music stages. Those displays accidentally mixed images from different years because volunteers organized pictures by subject rather than chronological order. Nobody noticed the mistake because every photograph showed familiar faces standing beside the same ferry dock under similar gray skies and jackets. Conversations naturally filled missing details until separate evenings slowly fused into one unforgettable community memory shared across generations. Each retelling strengthened confidence because listeners trusted neighbors more than faded captions hanging beneath aging display boards. Even people absent during both events eventually believed they remembered standing nearby while hearing frightened voices across the water. Lyle finally admitted he probably repeated stories heard from older employees rather than recalling every detail through direct personal experience himself. He arrived at the dock months after the actual missing child report, although years of conversation convinced him otherwise without deliberate deception. His memory felt completely genuine because repeated stories often settled into personal identity after enough familiar retellings inside close communities. He seemed embarrassed, although Neria assured him mistaken memory differed greatly from intentional dishonesty during insurance investigations. One unanswered question still remained because missing inspection reports could not be explained through confused memories or mixed historical photographs alone. Naria contacted the regional records warehouse, storing duplicate maintenance documents submitted before every operating season across public transportation facilities. Staff located forgotten copies filed beneath an outdated district code abandoned after municipal boundary changes several years earlier. The reports confirmed every required inspection occurred on schedule despite appearing missing inside local office cabinets. That discovery quietly resolved the insurance dispute because maintenance obligations had actually been completed before every reported damage claim reached investigators. The missing paperwork resulted from administrative filing changes rather than negligence hidden behind invented emergencies or deliberate fraud. Combined evidence painted a far less dramatic picture than local rumors suggested, although the truth required patience and careful comparison across many overlooked sources. Every confusing piece finally fit together without relying upon impossible explanations or mysterious disappearances beyond ordinary human memory. Before leaving town, Neria stood near the loading ramp watching another ferry glide smoothly toward weathered wooden pilings beneath calm afternoon skies. Families carried bags while children laughed across the deck, and workers secured thick ropes with practiced movements before welcoming new passengers aboard. Nothing about the peaceful scene matched terrifying stories repeated for years across nearby neighborhoods and waterfront cafes. Yet every confident witness truly believed those frightening memories belonged exactly where they recalled experiencing them. Her final report avoided mocking anyone because research consistently showed sincere people could remember impossible combinations with complete confidence after enough repetition. She carefully documented archived calls, newspaper records, historical photographs, maintenance files, and witness interviews before presenting a clear chronological reconstruction. The insurance company closed the investigation without further dispute because evidence supported ordinary explanations rather than mysterious recurring incidents. Local residents slowly accepted the corrected timeline, although many still paused before speaking about that famous night. Months later, the Historical Society replaced every display caption and arranged photographs according to verified dates instead of familiar themes. Visitors still gathered around the ferry dock, sharing stories passed through families for many years across changing generations. They simply told those stories differently after learning 2 ordinary evenings had quietly become one unforgettable memory. The harbor remained unchanged, although everyone finally remembered the right nights instead of only the wrong one. The stories. The caretaker found something beneath the old water tower. The old water tower had stood above the valley for nearly 70 years without attracting much attention from anyone nearby. Reportedly, the only reason investigators returned was because a caretaker noticed something buried beneath the aging concrete foundation. Garen Holt was 46 years old and worked as the full-time caretaker for a quiet public utility property outside a small farming town. His routine rarely changed because most days involved clearing weeds, checking fences, and inspecting equipment before driving home before sunset. The tower had stopped supplying water years earlier, but the surrounding land still belonged to the local district and required regular maintenance. Most residents ignored the lonely structure because newer facilities had replaced it decades before, leaving only faded steel and cracked concrete behind. One cool morning during early autumn in 2014, Garen arrived before sunrise with a truck full of replacement fencing supplies. Heavy rain had passed through the valley overnight, leaving muddy ground and scattered branches across the maintenance road leading uphill. He expected another quiet shift without interruptions because very few people ever visited the abandoned property anymore. While trimming thick weeds beside the tower, Garen noticed fresh soil piled against one section of the circular concrete base. At first, he assumed rainwater had washed loose dirt downhill during the storm, but the pile looked strangely neat. The mud formed a narrow ridge that almost seemed carefully placed instead of naturally deposited by heavy rainfall. He pushed the dirt aside with a shovel and struck something that produced a dull metallic sound beneath several inches of wet earth. Expecting an old pipe, he cleared another section until part of a rusted steel panel became visible under the mud. The panel looked far newer than the surrounding concrete, despite obvious corrosion along its outer edges. Garin stepped back and studied the ground for several quiet minutes before calling his supervisor through the district radio system. He described the unexpected metal cover and suggested old maintenance records might explain why it existed beneath the foundation. His supervisor admitted no known access panel appeared on current property maps or archived engineering drawings. Later that morning, another employee named Orland Pike arrived with copies of several worn inspection binders stored inside the district office. Together, they searched every available diagram but failed to locate any reference matching the hidden steel cover beneath the tower. Most records dated back to the 1970s because earlier paperwork had reportedly disappeared during an office relocation years before. Neither worker wanted to force the cover open without authorization because the unknown space beneath could contain unstable equipment or hazardous materials. The district manager contacted county officials who agreed to inspect the site before excavation continued any further that afternoon. Investigators arrived carrying cameras, measuring tools, and portable lighting equipment. They photographed the exposed section before carefully removing additional soil surrounding the rusted panel. As more earth disappeared, the workers uncovered a rectangular hatch secured by 4 heavy bolts still locked tightly into reinforced concrete. The hatch showed signs of deliberate installation rather than emergency repairs because every edge fit perfectly against the surrounding foundation. No utility markings appeared anywhere across the steel surface despite decades of weather exposure above ground. One investigator quietly remarked that someone had intended the entrance to remain unnoticed for a very long time. County officials obtained permission to remove the bolts after confirming no active utility systems connected to the hidden structure. The hatch resisted several attempts before finally lifting with a loud scraping sound that echoed across the empty hillside. Cool, stale air drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable smell of damp concrete and long-sealed spaces. A narrow ladder disappeared into darkness beneath the tower foundation. Portable lights revealed a surprisingly clean underground chamber extending several yards beyond the visible opening. The room contained electrical conduit, old shelves, and several empty storage crates covered with thick layers of gray dust. Nothing immediately suggested criminal activity, yet something felt unusual because every object appeared carefully arranged despite years of abandonment. The shelves held faded labels without supplies, while several hooks lined one wall without any remaining equipment attached. It looked less like forgotten storage and more like a room intentionally cleared before someone locked it forever. Investigators documented every surface before entering the chamber. Dust patterns suggested nobody had walked inside for many years because the floor remained almost completely undisturbed. Only small insects had crossed the concrete during the long period of isolation beneath the tower. Along one wall, an aging filing cabinet remained locked. After photographing its condition, officials carefully forced the drawer open using simple hand tools brought for evidence collection. Inside rested weathered notebooks wrapped inside protective plastic that had preserved their pages surprisingly well despite underground moisture. The notebooks belonged to a maintenance supervisor whose employment records ended during the late 1960s. His entries described routine inspections, equipment repairs, and repeated references to unauthorized nighttime visitors near the tower property. Several pages mentioned unfamiliar vehicles arriving after midnight without official district approval. One particular entry caught immediate attention because it described hearing excavation equipment operating beneath the tower during scheduled maintenance closures. The supervisor reported questioning another department manager who dismissed the strange activity without offering any explanation. After that conversation, the notebook mentioned growing concern about undocumented construction beneath the property. Archived payroll records later confirmed the supervisor unexpectedly resigned only weeks after writing those final observations. According to surviving employment documents, he never submitted another maintenance report before leaving the district permanently. No disciplinary actions appeared within his personnel file, leaving investigators uncertain why his career ended so suddenly. The remaining notebooks included rough sketches showing measurements that closely matched the hidden underground room discovered decades later. Those drawings also identified another narrow passage extending beyond the visible chamber wall. Investigators carefully measured the concrete and realized the sketches remained remarkably accurate despite their age. Ground-penetrating equipment confirmed an empty space beyond the western wall, exactly where the drawings suggested another section existed. Workers slowly removed a thin layer of concrete that looked newer than surrounding construction materials. Behind the barrier, they uncovered a second, smaller room, sealed far more carefully than the first chamber. Unlike the storage area, this hidden compartment contained several metal boxes stacked neatly against the rear wall. Every container remained locked, with matching brass padlocks showing only light corrosion after decades underground. Investigators transported the boxes above ground before opening them under controlled documentation procedures. Inside rested hundreds of photographic negatives, maintenance receipts, handwritten correspondence, and audio recording reels carefully wrapped inside waterproof packaging. Most materials related to utility operations during the 1950s and 1960s. At first glance, nothing appeared especially remarkable until technicians examined the photographs more closely. Several images showed construction crews working beneath the water tower before official completion of the surrounding facility. Those underground spaces never appeared within approved engineering plans preserved by the district archives. Additional photographs revealed temporary equipment installed inside the chamber before everything disappeared from later records. The audio reels required careful restoration because their magnetic surfaces had deteriorated over many decades. Specialists eventually recovered several conversations recorded during engineering meetings connected with the tower construction project. Voices discussed emergency communication equipment intended for regional disaster planning during a tense period of national uncertainty. According to the recordings, the underground rooms had served as a protected communications backup rather than ordinary storage. Officials planned to maintain radio equipment capable of operating independently if major infrastructure failed across the surrounding counties. The project remained highly confidential during its early years because civil defense planning often avoided unnecessary public attention. Several years later, improved technology made the small facility obsolete before full activation ever occurred. Budget reductions reportedly canceled ongoing maintenance, while responsibility shifted between different government departments. During those administrative changes, many original construction records quietly disappeared from ordinary filing systems. The maintenance supervisor who filled the notebooks apparently discovered pieces of that forgotten history without receiving any clear explanation from senior administrators. His growing frustration appeared throughout the later journal entries because unanswered questions replaced routine maintenance notes. Investigators believed he preserved copies of important records inside the underground room, hoping someone would eventually understand their significance. Witness statements collected from retired employees supported parts of that conclusion. One former electrician remembered hearing older coworkers joke about a secret room nobody officially acknowledged during training. Another retiree recalled delivering replacement electrical parts to the tower without ever seeing where those supplies were actually installed. Archived county meeting minutes also referenced unexplained maintenance funding connected to the abandoned tower during the early 1970s. Those expenses stopped appearing after administrative restructuring transferred responsibility between several agencies. No later documents mentioned underground facilities anywhere within the property boundaries. Forensic examination found no evidence suggesting violence or criminal concealment inside either underground chamber. Instead, investigators concluded the rooms represented forgotten infrastructure slowly erased through decades of changing offices and incomplete record-keeping. The mystery survived because each generation inherited less information than the people before them. Guerin returned to normal maintenance duties several weeks after investigators completed their examination of the property. The hatch remained secured with modern locks, while preservation teams cataloged every recovered notebook, photograph, and recording for historical archives. Local residents finally understood why the strange discovery attracted so much official attention despite revealing no hidden treasure. The old tower still stood quietly above the valley after the investigation ended, looking almost unchanged against the familiar skyline every evening. Yet everyone who passed the weathered structure understood that ordinary places sometimes protected forgotten chapters of history beneath their silent foundations. The stories. 5 archived calls investigators couldn't ignore. The investigation changed after 5 archived calls surfaced from forgotten storage, and every recording quietly challenged the official timeline. Years after the case was considered closed, those recordings still appeared in training discussions because experienced investigators believed they revealed what everyone else missed. Tavian Mercer was 39 years old and worked as an evidence review specialist for a regional investigative office. Most of his days involved organizing forgotten reports that nobody expected to matter again. The work rarely brought surprises, but careful habits often uncovered mistakes hidden beneath ordinary paperwork. One cool morning during early fall, Tavian received several aging storage boxes from a county archive preparing for digital conversion. The labels looked faded, and several folders carried handwritten notes that barely remained readable. Everything appeared routine because the files belonged to investigations officially completed many years before. One cardboard box contained several cassette tapes inside worn paper sleeves with matching evidence numbers. A faded note explained the recordings came from an abandoned dispatch backup system discovered during building renovations. Nobody remembered transferring those tapes into the main archive after the communications center upgraded its equipment. The evidence catalog listed every tape as duplicate material with no investigative value. That description normally meant the contents repeated recordings already preserved elsewhere without adding anything important. Tavian still followed office procedure because duplicate evidence occasionally revealed technical differences affecting older investigations. The first recording began with ordinary emergency traffic recorded during 1997 across several neighboring towns. Static interrupted several conversations, yet the audio quality remained surprisingly clear despite the tape's age. Nothing unusual appeared until one dispatcher quietly mentioned another incoming line nobody else seemed able to hear. The dispatcher answered calmly and asked the caller to describe the emergency before sending assistance toward the reported location. A nervous male voice requested officers near an empty service station outside a small industrial district before the connection suddenly disappeared. Dispatch records listed no responding units because another operator apparently never heard that exchange. Tavian paused the recording several times while comparing dispatch logs stored inside nearby folders. The written timeline skipped directly from one routine traffic stop toward an unrelated medical emergency minutes later. No mention existed regarding the frightened caller or the abandoned service station mentioned during the recording. He assumed someone accidentally recorded unrelated radio interference during ordinary communications equipment testing. Older analog systems sometimes captured distant broadcasts under unusual weather conditions across neighboring counties. That explanation sounded reasonable until the second archive tape repeated the same unfamiliar voice. The second call occurred almost 3 weeks later during another overnight shift handled by different dispatch personnel. The same anxious voice requested help before abruptly stopping whenever the operator asked for a specific location. Every available unit remained busy elsewhere according to surviving staffing schedules from that evening. Again, the written dispatch log contained absolutely nothing matching the conversation preserved on tape. The operator responding during the recording later completed an ordinary shift report without mentioning technical problems. Tavian realized 2 separate recordings shared identical omissions despite involving different employees weeks apart. Curious rather than convinced, he requested access to retired maintenance records covering the communications center during that period. Equipment technicians documented occasional recording failures caused by aging hardware nearing complete replacement after several years of continuous operation. None of those reports explained why missing conversations survived only inside backup tapes. His supervisor approved additional review because the request required little expense and involved historical records already scheduled for preservation. Nobody expected meaningful discoveries because the investigation connected with those dates reached its official conclusion decades earlier. The review simply ensured archival accuracy before permanent digitization. The closed investigation involved a warehouse fire that claimed one maintenance worker during a weekend storm. Authorities originally concluded faulty electrical wiring caused the blaze after examining extensive structural damage throughout the property. Insurance investigators supported that finding, and no criminal charges ever followed. While reading witness interviews, Tavian noticed several people mentioning strange activity near the abandoned service station before the warehouse fire. Detectives dismissed those comments because nobody connected them with the final incident occurring miles away. The statements remained buried inside supplemental notes, rarely reviewed after the investigation ended. The third archived call immediately captured everyone's attention once Tavian reached the middle portion of another cassette. The frightened caller no longer asked for immediate assistance, but instead repeatedly warned someone was moving equipment after dark. He insisted trucks entered empty industrial properties without leaving normal delivery paperwork behind. Dispatchers attempted gathering more information while tracing the incoming connection through outdated switching equipment. Before any location became clear, the line produced heavy interference and then completely disappeared. The responding operator documented unusual static, but never referenced the detailed warning preserved on the backup recording. Tavian invited another evidence specialist named Mirek Salvi to independently examine every tape without sharing personal conclusions beforehand. Mirek listened carefully across 2 afternoons before comparing handwritten notes with existing investigative documents. Both reviewers identified identical discrepancies without discussing possible explanations during the review process. That agreement persuaded their supervisor to reopen archival examination under formal quality assurance procedures. The goal remained limited because nobody claimed the old investigation definitely reached an incorrect conclusion. They simply wanted to understand why dispatch recordings differed from preserved written records. Mirek suggested locating retired communications employees who might remember equipment failures from those years. Several former dispatchers agreed to brief interviews after learning the office focused on historical record preservation rather than personal responsibility. Most remembered frustrating technology problems, but nobody recalled the mysterious conversations. One retired supervisor finally recognized something unusual after hearing several carefully selected audio segments. She quietly admitted overnight operators occasionally mentioned hearing incomplete emergency calls that vanished before proper tracing could begin. Management believed exhausted staff misunderstood radio interference because no matching paperwork ever existed. She also remembered technicians installing temporary recording equipment while replacing aging communication hardware during that same period. Backup machines sometimes captured raw audio before dispatch software filtered damaged transmissions from permanent storage. Nobody realized those temporary tapes survived because contractors packed them into miscellaneous archive boxes after renovations finished. That explanation clarified why duplicate recordings actually contained conversations missing from official digital archives. The backup equipment preserved every incoming signal before operators categorized calls according to established procedures. Damaged recordings considered unusable simply disappeared from permanent records despite remaining physically stored elsewhere. The fourth archived call proved far more detailed than every previous recording preserved inside the forgotten collection. The anxious caller described seeing portable fuel containers unloaded beside an empty warehouse several nights before the fatal fire. He insisted nobody working nearby recognized the vehicles involved in those nighttime deliveries. Investigators reviewing original photographs discovered one overlooked image showing faint tire impressions behind the burned warehouse. Analysts dismissed those marks because heavy rain complicated accurate comparison with available vehicle records after the incident. Nobody connected them with anonymous warnings received before the fire. Another forgotten envelope contained undeveloped negatives processed years after the original investigation concluded. Those images revealed additional delivery trucks parked near neighboring buildings during evenings preceding the warehouse disaster. The license plates remained unreadable, but vehicle shapes closely matched descriptions mentioned during archived recordings. Tavian avoided dramatic conclusions because the evidence still lacked direct proof connecting unknown vehicles with the deadly fire. Instead, he assembled a chronological timeline comparing dispatch recordings, witness interviews, photographs, maintenance records, and archived investigative notes. Patterns slowly emerged without requiring speculation beyond documented material. The anonymous caller consistently reported unusual deliveries involving empty industrial properties before requesting officers investigate suspicious nighttime activity. Witness statements independently described unfamiliar trucks appearing briefly before disappearing without routine commercial paperwork. Those separate sources strengthened each other despite remaining completely independent during the original investigation. Attention shifted toward the fifth archived call because it represented the final preserved conversation before the warehouse burned. The same voice sounded calmer but noticeably exhausted while carefully describing a locked storage area behind the abandoned service station. He urged dispatchers to inspect the location before saying somebody finally realized repeated calls had been ignored. The connection ended moments later after loud mechanical noises interrupted the conversation with overwhelming interference. Unlike previous recordings, the operator immediately reported hearing something unusual before another emergency diverted available resources elsewhere. That interruption prevented anyone from checking the abandoned service station until weeks after the fatal fire. Historical property records showed demolition crews cleared the abandoned station during the following spring after repeated vandalism reports. No detailed inspection occurred because the property held no obvious connection with the warehouse investigation. Whatever existed behind the locked storage area disappeared long before anyone reconsidered anonymous emergency calls. Retired detectives admitted the newly recovered recordings would have changed investigative priorities had they existed inside original evidence files. They emphasized nobody intentionally ignored valuable information because dispatch logs simply never reflected those conversations. Every decision followed documentation available during that period. Technical experts examining preserved cassettes confirmed the recordings showed no meaningful signs of editing or later manipulation. Magnetic patterns matched expected aging characteristics found in authentic analog evidence stored for many years. Their findings supported the conclusion that forgotten backup equipment accidentally preserved important communications. The office ultimately amended archival records rather than reopening criminal proceedings without stronger physical evidence supporting deliberate wrongdoing. The revised file acknowledged previously unavailable recordings and documented their relationship with witness statements overlooked during the original review. Future investigators could now understand exactly why important questions remained unanswered. Tavian returned every cassette into climate-controlled storage after digitization finished under carefully supervised preservation standards. Unlike previous decades, each recording now appeared within searchable archives available for legitimate investigative review. Forgotten voices would never again disappear beneath mislabeled evidence boxes gathering silent dust. The final report avoided dramatic language because documented facts already carried enough weight without unnecessary embellishment. 5 archived calls survived only because outdated backup equipment, quietly recorded conversations, official systems failed to preserve. Sometimes these smallest forgotten records patiently waited until careful people finally asked the right questions. The stories. This forgotten receipt solved a decades-old mystery. The The faded receipt stayed unnoticed for nearly 30 years before someone finally realized it explained a disappearance that never made sense. Archived records later showed the small piece of paper had been filed inside the wrong evidence envelope during an overlooked inventory review. Neria Holt was 38 years old and worked as a record supervisor for a regional archive that stored retired investigation files. She preferred quiet routines because every box followed predictable rules and every document belonged somewhere specific. Her assignment that morning seemed ordinary because the department planned another routine audit before moving thousands of aging files into climate-controlled storage. The building stood outside a small manufacturing town where several factories had closed during the late 1990s. Dust-covered forgotten shelves and handwritten labels slowly faded under weak fluorescent lights that hummed through every hallway. Most employees hurried through the work because the archive rarely revealed anything more interesting than old permits or insurance forms. Neria reached a damaged evidence carton whose inventory tag never matched previous database entries kept inside the department computer. Earlier workers had simply marked the difference as a counting mistake because nobody expected anything important remained inside those forgotten folders. She decided to compare every document one page at a time because inaccurate records usually created bigger problems later. Several envelopes contained photographs from an unresolved missing person investigation that officially ended without enough evidence for criminal charges. The missing mechanic had vanished during the late 1990s after leaving work before sunset on what witnesses described as an ordinary afternoon. His family eventually accepted uncertainty because every promising lead collapsed after careful review by investigators. Near the bottom of one envelope, Neria noticed a folded receipt tucked behind several blank evidence inventory sheets without explanation. The paper looked unimportant because faded ink barely showed the business name across the worn surface after decades inside storage. She almost placed it aside until one handwritten note caught her attention with unusual timing beside the printed purchase details. The receipt listed fuel and a replacement fan belt purchased shortly after the mechanic reportedly disappeared from public view forever. Investigators had always believed he left directly from work without stopping anywhere before every trace unexpectedly ended. The purchase time challenged that assumption because it happened almost 2 hours after coworkers believed he vanished. Neria reported the discovery according to department policy before touching anything else inside the old evidence envelope again. Her supervisor initially expected another filing mistake because forgotten paperwork appeared during nearly every large archive inspection completed that season. Still, the supervisor contacted retired investigators because documented evidence required formal review regardless of apparent importance. Retired Detective Orson Vale agreed to examine the material after hearing the receipt had never appeared inside original investigation summaries. He had spent years believing someone accidentally ignored a crucial witness rather than intentionally hiding meaningful evidence from the official record. Curiosity brought him back because unresolved cases rarely received legitimate opportunities after so much passing time. Orson carefully compared archived interviews with the purchase location printed across the fading receipt from the old hardware station. He noticed one cashier statement mentioned helping a nervous customer during that same evening, although investigators dismissed the memory as unreliable. The witness never described the missing mechanic directly because nobody showed store employees current photographs during initial interviews. The archive also preserved outdated dispatch logs copied onto paper before digital systems became common across neighboring jurisdictions. Those logs revealed a disabled pickup truck reported beside an abandoned service road shortly after the receipt time appeared. Officers responded briefly, then cleared the call because another emergency demanded immediate attention across the county. Original case files barely mentioned the disabled truck because responding officers never connected it with the missing mechanic investigation afterward. The vehicle description remained incomplete because darkness prevented accurate identification before the driver apparently repaired the problem independently. Nobody recognized the coincidence since separate reports entered different filing systems maintained by different administrative offices. Orson requested surviving maintenance records from the closed hardware station whose owners had stored old business documents inside a warehouse. Most receipts disappeared years earlier after flood damage destroyed filing cabinets and ruined cardboard storage boxes beyond practical recovery. One ledger somehow survived because an employee carried it home during renovation before forgetting about it. The handwritten ledger confirmed the receipt number matched a legitimate sale recorded that same evening without any irregular accounting errors. It also included a brief note describing cash payment after a customer requested directions toward an isolated gravel shortcut outside town. Employees often scribbled reminders beside unusual transactions because local management tracked recurring customer questions for training purposes. Investigators revisited witness interviews with fresh attention because the forgotten direction request suddenly changed several earlier assumptions completely. One retired delivery driver remembered passing a pickup beside that gravel route while another vehicle remained parked several yards behind it. He originally believed friends helped each other with roadside repairs because nothing seemed suspicious during daylight. His statement gained importance because archived weather reports confirmed clear visibility across the open farmland during those afternoon hours. Earlier, investigators questioned his memory after confusing storm records from another week entered the wrong reference folder during administrative filing. Corrected documentation supported his timeline instead of weakening it. Naria continued searching surrounding boxes because filing mistakes often appeared together rather than existing as isolated accidents inside neglected archives. She discovered several cassette recordings labeled only with outdated inventory numbers, lacking descriptive information or investigative summaries. Preservation staff converted the tapes into digital copies before age-erased fragile magnetic recordings forever. One interview featured an elderly farmer whose testimony ended abruptly when officers received another dispatch call requiring immediate response elsewhere. The farmer described hearing raised voices near the gravel shortcut before watching two vehicles leave separately within several minutes. He never recognized anyone because distance blocked clear identification across open fields. Investigators apparently considered his account too uncertain because nobody scheduled a follow-up interview after that interrupted recording session concluded. The missing mechanic family never knew such testimony existed because unfinished interviews stayed inside supplemental evidence rather than public summaries. Administrative pressure often pushed unresolved cases toward closure when stronger evidence never appeared. The receipt now fit naturally beside the forgotten recordings and overlooked dispatch report without forcing unlikely explanations into the investigation timeline. Together, they suggested the mechanic experienced vehicle trouble before encountering someone unexpectedly along the isolated shortcut outside town. That possibility differed sharply from earlier theories claiming voluntary disappearance without warning. Forensic specialists re-examined preserved photographs using modern enhancement methods unavailable during the original investigation years before. One roadside image revealed faint tire impressions extending beyond the visible shoulder toward an unused maintenance entrance hidden by overgrown brush. Earlier film quality prevented anyone from noticing those subtle marks clearly enough for meaningful interpretation. Survey records showed the maintenance entrance eventually became blocked after land ownership changed during the early 2000s. Dense vegetation gradually covered the narrow path until local residents barely remembered vehicles once traveled through that forgotten access road. The overlooked entrance explained why searches missed nearby areas despite extensive efforts. A careful ground survey uncovered remnants of an old vehicle hidden beneath collapsed wooden debris and thick vegetation accumulated across many seasons. Registration records confirmed the truck belonged to the missing mechanic, whose disappearance remained unexplained for nearly 3 decades. Natural decay preserved little physical evidence, yet the location answered the largest unanswered question. Mechanical examination indicated the fan belt had never been installed despite the purchase documented on the forgotten receipt. Investigators concluded the breakdown likely happened before repairs could begin because another event interrupted the simple maintenance task unexpectedly. That finding aligned closely with witness memories describing two vehicles stopped near each other. Further review uncovered financial records showing another local resident repeatedly denied traveling that route despite fuel purchases placing him nearby. Earlier, investigators never noticed the contradiction because transaction records stayed separate from interview materials under outdated filing procedures. The inconsistency justified renewed questioning, supported by stronger documentary evidence. The aging witness eventually admitted meeting the mechanic after receiving a request for roadside assistance through mutual acquaintances. According to his revised statement, an argument erupted over unpaid equipment debts that had simmered quietly for several months. He insisted panic followed an accidental struggle rather than a planned confrontation. Independent evidence supported portions of his revised account while contradicting several details intended to reduce personal responsibility afterward. Investigators compared archived photographs with current site conditions before reconstructing likely movements using documented distances and verified timelines. The forgotten receipt remained central because it fixed the sequence within a reliable timeframe. Prosecutors reviewed every surviving record carefully because decades had passed since the original investigation reached an uncertain conclusion. Some evidence no longer existed while several witnesses had already passed away, leaving only preserved statements behind. Even so, the complete timeline finally reflected consistent facts rather than disconnected assumptions. Narration never expected routine archive work would reshape a mystery that frustrated investigators and devastated one family for many years. She simply followed ordinary procedures with patience because accurate records mattered even when nobody expected meaningful discoveries anymore. Her careful attention accomplished what countless dramatic theories never managed, despite endless speculation. The family finally received a detailed explanation supported by documents instead of rumors, repeated across generations without reliable evidence. While every question could never be answered completely, the essential truth no longer remained buried beneath filing mistakes and forgotten paperwork. The smallest document inside the largest archive had quietly carried the missing answer all along. Years later, new employees still heard the story during archive training because every neglected page deserved careful attention before permanent storage decisions. They learned that evidence rarely announced its importance through dramatic appearance or obvious warnings visible at first glance. Sometimes an ordinary receipt simply waited for someone patient enough to read it carefully. The stories. Never stay after closing at that rural bus depot. The warning appeared in several archived maintenance notes, although nobody explained why the night shift always ended exactly on schedule. Former employees reportedly repeated the same advice for years, yet none of them ever agreed on what happened after the final departure. Maris Calder was 34 years old and worked as a regional transit safety inspector for a private transportation contractor. She spent most weeks checking aging facilities that rarely received attention from company headquarters. The assignment seemed ordinary because the depot served only a handful of daily routes across isolated farming communities. Her goal that afternoon was simple. She planned to inspect emergency lighting, verify maintenance records, and leave before sunset. The depot sat beside an abandoned freight line that had stopped operating decades earlier. A narrow parking lot stretched toward empty fields where tall grass covered forgotten service roads. The waiting room held faded benches and old travel posters that had not changed since the early 2000s. Everything looked neglected, although the building remained surprisingly clean despite its limited budget and low passenger traffic. The station manager was a quiet man named Orrin Vale, who had supervised the depot for almost 12 years. He welcomed Maris politely and answered every required question without hesitation. He also repeated one unusual request before returning to his paperwork. He asked her to finish everything before closing because nobody stayed inside afterward. His tone remained calm and practical without sounding dramatic or frightened. Maris assumed the request came from insurance rules or local security concerns that management preferred not to discuss openly. She thanked Oren and continued documenting fire extinguishers, electrical panels, and emergency exit signs across the property. Each inspection matched company standards except for several handwritten maintenance entries that lacked official signatures. The pages mentioned repeated inspections of platform lighting without describing any repairs. Late that afternoon, the final scheduled bus arrived, carrying only 3 passengers from a neighboring county. They collected their bags quickly and disappeared into waiting vehicles without lingering around the station. The driver completed his paperwork before speaking quietly with Oren near the entrance. Their conversation ended when both men looked briefly toward the empty platform before returning inside. Maris asked whether another bus would arrive later that evening because one schedule appeared partially erased. Oren explained the route had been canceled years earlier after passenger demand disappeared across several farming communities. The faded schedule remained because replacing the board cost more than management considered necessary. His explanation sounded reasonable enough, and Maris returned to photographing maintenance records. Closing time arrived with little excitement as lights inside the waiting room automatically switched into reduced power mode. Oren locked the ticket counter and gathered several folders before walking toward the exit. He noticed Maris reviewing electrical diagrams near the storage hallway and reminded her that inspections could continue the following morning. She replied that only one storage room remained unfinished and promised to leave within 15 minutes. Oren hesitated briefly before handing her a ring containing several labeled keys from older utility doors. He reminded her to lock everything before leaving and wished her a safe drive home. His truck disappeared down the empty road until darkness swallowed the distant headlights beyond the fields. Silence settled over the depot almost immediately after the engine noise faded into the distance. The building felt larger without conversations or arriving passengers moving through narrow hallways. Maris finished checking storage shelves filled with outdated safety equipment and prepared to leave through the main entrance. She noticed the digital wall clock showing exactly 8 o'clock, although her wristwatch displayed only 7:47. She compared both devices twice before assuming one battery had failed somewhere during the inspection. Her phone matched the wristwatch perfectly, and she dismissed the strange difference without much concern. While locking the storage room, she heard what sounded like luggage wheels crossing the platform outside. The noise lasted only several seconds before stopping completely near the entrance doors. Maris looked through the front windows, expecting to find a late traveler searching for assistance. The platform remained empty beneath pale security lights that illuminated cracked concrete and scattered leaves. She unlocked the entrance anyway and stepped outside to check the surrounding area carefully. No vehicles waited nearby, and no footsteps crossed the quiet parking lot. When she returned, inside the digital wall clock displayed 7:48 instead of 8 o'clock. She frowned while comparing it again with her phone because both devices suddenly matched perfectly. The brief inconsistency made little sense, but electronic equipment occasionally malfunctioned inside older buildings. She wrote a quick note recommending replacement before continuing toward the exit. Near the ticket counter, she noticed a small leather notebook resting beneath an empty bench. The cover looked worn from years of use, and no identification appeared anywhere inside. Most pages contained routine shift notes written by different employees across several years. Near the final section, the handwriting changed noticeably and became shorter with every entry. One page mentioned hearing an unscheduled arrival after closing, despite every official route ending before sunset. Another described platform lights activating without any recorded vehicle entering the property. Several entries referred to checking surveillance footage only to find empty platforms during reported incidents. None of the writers claimed seeing anything impossible, and every note remained surprisingly restrained. Maris found the final completed page, dated nearly 9 years earlier, in careful handwriting. It stated that every unusual report happened after someone ignored the closing policy. The writer advised future employees to leave immediately whenever unexplained arrival sounds echoed across the platform. Nothing else appeared after that sentence because the remaining pages stayed completely blank. She photographed several pages for documentation because unofficial maintenance journals sometimes revealed overlooked facility problems. While placing the notebook into an evidence envelope, she heard another rolling luggage sound outside the waiting room windows. This time, the noise continued steadily from one end of the platform toward the other. It stopped directly beside the closed entrance without another sound following afterward. Maris remained inside while watching the platform through large glass panels beside the entrance. The security lights revealed nothing except drifting insects circling bright fixtures above empty pavement. She considered calling Oren, but decided another inspection around the exterior would probably explain everything. Wildlife often created misleading sounds around quiet transportation facilities after dark. She unlocked the entrance once more and walked slowly along the platform with a flashlight. Fresh air carried the smell of damp soil drifting from nearby fields after a brief afternoon rain. The flashlight revealed old tire marks and scattered gravel without any recent footprints crossing dusty concrete. Everything suggested the area had remained empty since the final bus departed earlier that evening. As she turned back toward the building, a distant engine became faintly audible beyond the abandoned freight line. The sound resembled an approaching diesel bus climbing gradually along a rural highway. Maris waited several moments, expecting headlights to appear between clusters of dark trees nearby. Nothing emerged, although the engine continued growing louder with each passing second. The noise stopped instantly without fading away into the distance like normal traffic usually would. The sudden silence felt stranger than the sound itself because nearby insects also stopped moving for several seconds. When natural night sounds finally returned, they seemed unusually loud against the empty landscape surrounding the depot. Back inside the waiting room, Maris decided the inspection had gone far beyond routine documentation. She called the regional operations office, but reached only an automated overnight recording service. Before leaving a message, she noticed one overlooked cabinet beside the former dispatch office. The key labeled archives opened it without resistance and revealed several storage boxes filled with old operational records. Most files contained ordinary paperwork documenting repairs, staffing changes, and route adjustments across many decades. One thinner folder carried no official label except a handwritten date from the late 1980s. Inside rested copied witness statements gathered after an unexplained scheduling dispute involving an overnight charter request. Every statement agreed no authorized bus should have arrived that evening. Dispatch logs confirmed several employees reported hearing a vehicle approach the platform after closing. Two workers claimed they opened the entrance expecting stranded passengers needing assistance from station staff. Both described finding completely empty pavement beneath functioning platform lights, despite clearly hearing brakes and luggage compartments opening moments earlier. Management eventually closed the internal review without identifying any mechanical or environmental explanation. Maris compared those statements with the notebook entries she had photographed earlier that evening. These similarities felt too specific to dismiss as ordinary workplace folklore passed between generations of employees. Every account described sounds before sightings, and every report ended once people stayed inside instead of investigating. The pattern remained remarkably consistent across nearly 3 decades of unrelated documentation. She searched another archive box containing maintenance requests and security inspection reports from previous contractors. Several invoices mentioned replacing platform speakers after repeated false activation during overnight hours. Technicians consistently reported finding perfectly functioning equipment without electrical faults, explaining the mysterious announcements. Replacement parts never changed the recurring complaints documented during later inspections. One faded photograph slipped from an envelope while she organized papers across the dispatch counter. It showed the depot entrance sometime during the early 1990s after exterior renovations finished successfully. Standing near the platform edge appeared 3 maintenance workers smiling toward the camera under bright afternoon sunlight. Maris noticed one familiar detail immediately because Oren stood among them looking much younger. She examined the photograph closely before realizing something else seemed slightly unusual about the background. A 4th figure appeared near the far end of the platform, facing away from the camera completely. Nobody had mentioned another worker participating in the renovation project described beneath the photograph. The image quality remained poor enough that identifying the person became impossible. At that moment, an automated announcement echoed clearly through silent speakers above the waiting room. The calm, recorded voice welcomed passengers aboard an arriving regional service that no longer existed. Maris froze while listening because the route number matched the canceled schedule still hanging beside the entrance. After the announcement ended, the speakers returned immediately to complete silence. She walked carefully toward the electrical control room, carrying both the photograph and maintenance notebook together. Every equipment indicator displayed normal operation without warning lights or active communication signals from headquarters. System logs showed no scheduled announcements after closing and no recorded manual activation during the previous hour. Nothing inside the control cabinet explained what she had just heard. Another sound reached the waiting room before she finished checking electrical panels behind locked doors. This time, it resembled folding bus doors opening directly outside the entrance beneath bright platform lights. The noise lasted several seconds, followed by complete silence that seemed almost deliberate afterward. Maris resisted looking outside immediately because every written account warned against exactly that response. Instead, she reviewed archived dispatch logs once more, searching for details previous readers might have overlooked entirely. One supervisor had added a handwritten observation several months after the original witness interviews concluded. The note suggested every unexplained report happened when someone remained inside after official closing procedures ended. Employees leaving on schedule never experienced unusual sounds or false arrival announcements. Maris finally understood why Oren insisted she finish before closing without offering dramatic explanations that sounded unbelievable. The rule existed because arguing about impossible-sounding events never convinced skeptical visitors anyway. Quiet routines protected employees better than stories nobody outside the depot would likely accept. She packed every photographed record into sealed evidence envelopes before switching off unnecessary lights throughout the building. The platform remained visible through entrance windows, although she deliberately avoided studying distant shadows beyond illuminated concrete. Another announcement never played, and no engine sounds returned while she prepared her departure carefully. The strange silence almost felt patient instead of threatening. After locking the entrance, she walked directly toward her vehicle without glancing back at the platform behind her. Gravel crunched beneath steady footsteps, while cool night air carried distant sounds from ordinary highway traffic miles away. Nothing unusual happened before she started the engine and drove slowly toward the main road. The following morning, Maris met Oren inside the depot office before regular passengers began arriving for scheduled departures. She asked whether the old notebook belonged to anyone still employed by the company today. Oren recognized it immediately and explained the final writer had retired years earlier after supervising evening operations for decades. He quietly admitted nobody ever discarded the notebook because every replacement eventually found it again. Her official inspection report documented aging communication equipment, outdated electrical displays, and several archive preservation recommendations requiring future maintenance funding. It also included copies of overlooked historical records that deserved permanent storage instead of forgotten cabinets. One observation never appeared anywhere within the final report because no technical language could explain it convincingly. Years later, another inspector reportedly asked Oren why every employee left exactly when closing procedures finished each evening. He answered with the same calm voice Maris remembered from that first inspection without adding unnecessary details. The building worked well enough during business hours, but nobody stayed after closing because the records had already explained everything anyone needed to know. The stories. The evidence locker held one box nobody would open. Every inventory report reached the same conclusion. One sealed evidence box remained untouched through decades of routine inspections and careful documentation. Maris Rowan was 36 years old and worked as a county evidence technician in a quiet government storage building. She handled forgotten property every weekday and expected another ordinary shift before heading home that evening. The building served several neighboring towns after older stations merged their records during the late 1990s. Every shelf carried faded labels and dusty containers that rarely attracted attention beyond annual audits. Maris enjoyed predictable work because every object usually matched a report waiting somewhere inside thick filing cabinets. She trusted paperwork more than rumors because documents usually explained strange situations without leaving unnecessary questions behind. That morning began with another inventory requested after software records replaced thousands of handwritten property entries from previous decades. Several retired officers volunteered small corrections because they remembered cases recorded before computers became standard across the regional departments. Maris appreciated their patience because forgotten details often prevented expensive mistakes during evidence transfers between facilities. She carried a barcode scanner through narrow aisles while comparing printed inventories against weathered tags attached across metal shelving. Everything matched until one shelf displayed a handwritten number that never appeared inside any electronic record. The missing entry belonged to a medium-sized cardboard box wrapped with faded security tape and covered beneath several thin layers of dust. An old paper tag listed only an intake month during 1994 and a reference code without descriptive notes. Every neighboring container carried complete descriptions, including clothing, photographs, or recovered personal belongings connected with closed investigations. That single box offered nothing except careful sealing that somehow remained untouched despite countless inspections over many years. Maris checked older paper ledgers expecting a simple clerical mistake that delayed proper cataloging before someone eventually corrected forgotten information. Every ledger skipped the reference code completely, although nearby entries remained perfectly organized across matching dates and storage locations. She searched another archive cabinet containing duplicate inventories prepared after a flood damaged several municipal offices during 1997. Those replacement files also ignored the mysterious reference code despite preserving surrounding evidence records with surprising accuracy. Curious but careful, Maris asked her supervisor, Calder Voss, whether anyone remembered the unidentified container resting inside the secured storage room. Calder paused longer than expected before answering that everyone noticed the box eventually, but nobody volunteered opening authorization. His explanation sounded strangely incomplete because official evidence required documented review whenever ownership records disappeared from departmental archive. Maris requested written guidance, although Calder quietly suggested leaving the container alone until another scheduled administrative meeting. That response unsettled her because routine procedures rarely allowed uncertainty surrounding sealed government property with missing documentation and unclear legal status. She requested archived dispatch logs from an off-site warehouse storing old communication transcripts preserved on aging magnetic tapes and printed copies. The warehouse clerk located several folders matching the intake month, although many pages showed water damage from earlier storage problems. Maris spent hours comparing dispatch references against intake numbers while carefully avoiding unsupported assumptions about missing investigative paperwork. Late that afternoon, one damaged page revealed the same reference code, followed by only 3 brief words: temporary hold pending verification. Nothing else explained what required verification or which agency requested delaying ordinary evidence processing after collection. The dispatch page ended without signatures because the remaining section disappeared beneath torn edges and faded ink. Maris contacted a retired records clerk named Leona Brigg, who reportedly organized property transfers throughout the early 1990s. Leona welcomed questions because she believed forgotten records deserved proper attention before memories disappeared alongside former employees. She studied the copied reference code for several quiet moments before recognizing handwriting belonging to another administrative assistant. That assistant passed away many years earlier, leaving few surviving notes beyond ordinary payroll records and scheduling calendars. Leona remembered one unusual week when several agencies exchanged paperwork after a nighttime highway incident involving an abandoned government vehicle. She emphasized that nobody died during the reported event, according to internal briefings shared among administrative employees. Investigators reportedly found scattered documents across wet pavement, although witnesses disagreed about who collected every recovered item. Leona never handled field evidence personally, but remembered confusion surrounding duplicated inventories prepared during following administrative reviews. Those memories encouraged Morris to search archived meeting minutes stored inside dusty binders, rarely requested by modern investigators or county officials. One administrative summary mentioned temporary evidence segregation until jurisdiction questions received formal resolution from supervising attorneys. Another page referenced incomplete photographic records because original film reportedly vanished before development reached the contracted laboratory. Every mention stopped abruptly without explaining final decisions regarding the unidentified property collected during that confusing week. Maris requested access to microfilm newspaper archives, hoping local reporting captured details overlooked within damaged departmental paperwork and forgotten meeting notes. Small articles described heavy rain causing multiple traffic closures after an unmarked government sedan left the roadway near abandoned farmland. Reporters mentioned recovered equipment, but never listed personal injuries or criminal charges connected with the incident. Follow-up articles disappeared within days because another major regional story dominated public attention during that same week. Something still refused to fit together because ordinary administrative confusion rarely erased every meaningful description surrounding preserved physical evidence. Maris examined the sealed box carefully without breaking security tape or disturbing documented chain of custody requirements. She noticed tiny impressions beneath aged cardboard, suggesting several flat objects rested inside protective envelopes instead of bulky physical items. The weight also felt surprisingly light, according to original intake measurements preserved beside the faded shelf label. Calder eventually approached after noticing her continued research surrounding the forgotten container occupying valuable shelf space inside secured storage. He admitted another technician asked similar questions almost 15 years earlier before accepting transfer to another county position. That technician reportedly concluded missing paperwork resulted from harmless administrative mistakes after reviewing available documentation during several quiet afternoons. Calder never questioned that conclusion because nothing suggested criminal misconduct or immediate legal concerns requiring additional departmental resources. Maris respected experience but believed unanswered records deserved complete explanations whenever public archives contained obvious contradictions and unexplained omissions. She requested authorization through formal channels instead of informal conversations that produced uncertain memories and conflicting personal impressions. Several administrators approved limited review because no active investigation appeared connected with the unidentified evidence reference anymore. Official permission finally arrived after nearly 2 weeks, accompanied by strict documentation requirements covering every observation during the opening process. 2 witnesses entered the evidence room before Maris photographed the untouched seals from every visible angle using department-issued equipment. Security tape showed natural aging without replacement marks, and every recorded signature matched preserved intake photographs discovered earlier that morning. Maris carefully cut the tape while another technician documented each step through continuous video required under updated departmental evidence policies. Everyone expected forgotten paperwork or damaged property hidden beneath protective wrapping inside the ordinary cardboard container. Instead, they discovered several sealed envelopes containing undeveloped photographic negatives and one compact cassette recorder protected inside plastic sleeves. Another envelope held handwritten notes signed only with initials rather than complete identifying information from any known investigator. Every item appeared dry and remarkably preserved because careful packaging prevented moisture from reaching sensitive recording materials through passing decades. The county arranged professional recovery because older media required specialized equipment unavailable inside ordinary government offices handling current evidence procedures. Technicians successfully developed the negatives, while audio experts restored faint recordings captured on the aging cassette without altering original content. Maris waited anxiously because every recovered piece might finally explain why complete documentation vanished from official archives so completely. The photographs revealed government inventory forms spread across a folding table during what appeared to be temporary roadside evidence processing. Every image focused on paperwork rather than damaged vehicles or surrounding landscape captured beyond the narrow inspection area. One photograph clearly showed duplicate evidence tags attached accidentally to identical property envelopes prepared by separate responding agencies. Another image displayed supervisors comparing conflicting intake sheets while discussing corrections apparently never completed after jurisdiction changed unexpectedly. The restored recording contained no dramatic confession or hidden criminal conspiracy waiting beneath decades of silence and speculation. Instead, several calm voices discussed preventing chain of custody confusion before duplicated evidence reached different regional storage facilities after emergency collection. One speaker insisted every duplicate record required immediate reconciliation because future investigators might question missing paperwork without complete explanations. Another voice responded that severe weather already scattered documents across roadside mud, making perfect reconstruction nearly impossible before transport deadlines arrived. The handwritten notes finally connected every lingering question through careful observations prepared by an unnamed administrative employee monitoring evidence transfers that difficult week. The writer explained duplicate documentation created legal uncertainty because two agencies unknowingly assigned separate reference numbers to identical recovered materials. One complete record eventually followed proper jurisdiction, while the duplicate container remained isolated pending administrative verification that never officially concluded. Successive office relocations buried unfinished paperwork beneath larger consolidation projects until institutional memory quietly disappeared across passing generations. Maris compared every recovered detail against surviving dispatch logs and replacement inventories before preparing a comprehensive internal report for county administrators. Her report avoided dramatic conclusions because available evidence supported ordinary bureaucratic failure rather than intentional concealment or criminal misconduct. Every contradiction aligned logically once duplicate numbering explained missing references across separated archives maintained by different departments through many years. County officials updated electronic records after confirming recovered photographs matched surviving documentation preserved inside another regional evidence facility. The forgotten box finally received complete identification before administrators authorized appropriate archival transfer according to current legal retention requirements. Calder thanked Maris quietly because persistent attention solved a mystery that lingered far longer than anyone expected within ordinary government storage. Leona later received a copy of the finalized administrative summary because her memories helped reconnect forgotten paperwork with preserved physical evidence. She smiled after reading the conclusion because decades of uncertainty finally ended through patience instead of speculation or exaggerated theories. Maris returned to ordinary inventory work, carrying greater respect for quiet records that seemed insignificant beneath layers of dust and fading ink. The sealed box never contained impossible secrets or hidden treasures, despite years of whispered curiosity among changing generations of employees. It held something more believable and perhaps more unsettling. Simple, unfinished paperwork quietly survived longer than everyone responsible for explaining its purpose. The evidence locker finally closed another chapter because careful questions proved stronger than comfortable assumptions waiting silently across forgotten shelves. The stories. The search team missed one cabin until sunrise. The search team missed one cabin until sunrise. Archived search records from a remote mountain rescue reportedly revealed one cabin that nobody entered until first light. Witness statements later suggested that single mistake changed everything investigators believed about the missing caretaker. Nolan Voss was 38 years old and worked as a seasonal forestry caretaker in a quiet mountain recreation area. His routine rarely changed because visitors almost disappeared once heavy autumn storms reached the higher trails every year. That afternoon, he planned to inspect several empty rental cabins before locking the access road for the coming weekend. Weather reports predicted steady rain after sunset and strong winds before midnight across the surrounding forest. A maintenance worker watched Nolan drive toward the northern cabins shortly before evening with ordinary inspection forms resting on the passenger seat. Nothing about the departure appeared unusual because everyone expected him back before darkness covered the valley. When night arrived without any message from Nolan, the maintenance office attempted several radio calls without receiving even brief confirmation. Cell coverage remained unreliable across the mountain, and failed transmissions happened often during severe weather conditions. The supervisor waited another hour before contacting local emergency services because delayed returns occasionally happened after fallen trees blocked narrow roads. Dispatch logs later confirmed that concern increased once another worker reached Nolan's parked utility truck without finding him nearby. The truck stood beside a muddy service trail with the driver door locked and the inspection clipboard still inside the cabin. Fresh boot prints led toward a cluster of abandoned rental cabins sitting beyond an old picnic clearing. Rain erased much of the visible trail before volunteer search teams reached the area with flashlights and emergency medical supplies. They divided into small groups because the thick woods prevented larger teams from moving safely between steep rocky slopes. Each team carried printed maps showing every known structure remaining inside the recreation area, despite several buildings closing decades earlier. Those maps came from maintenance records updated during the previous spring, according to archived office paperwork. The first hours produced almost nothing beyond scattered footprints and one flashlight resting beside a broken wooden footbridge near the creek. Search volunteers assumed the flashlight belonged to Nolan because coworkers recognized a faded strip of reflective tape. A volunteer named Bren Orwick noticed faint tire tracks continuing farther uphill beyond the official maintenance route before heavy rain washed them away. Team leaders marked the location, but decided human tracks deserved greater attention during the dangerous weather. Several searchers reached 6 abandoned cabins before midnight and found each building empty except for old furniture and damaged roofing materials. Every unlocked door received a quick inspection before volunteers moved toward the next location on their assigned route. The weather worsened steadily and visibility dropped until even nearby flashlights became blurry shapes through the constant sheets of rain. Team leaders ordered everyone to regroup before continuing because exhaustion increased the risk of injuries along unstable slopes. Dispatch recordings later described the operation as organized despite difficult conditions and no obvious mistakes during the first search period. Every known trail received attention and every listed structure appeared checked according to handwritten field reports. Just after midnight, a retired groundskeeper contacted emergency coordinators after hearing radio traffic through a volunteer monitoring channel at home. He quietly mentioned remembering one maintenance cabin missing from newer property maps after a budget review years earlier. The comment sounded uncertain because the forgotten cabin supposedly lost electrical service decades before the recreation area reduced seasonal staffing. Nobody immediately changed the search plan because no recent maintenance records mentioned that isolated building anymore. The retired groundskeeper searched through old filing boxes stored inside his garage before finding faded photocopies from 1994. Those documents showed an additional storage cabin hidden beyond a narrow logging road, abandoned after repeated landslides damaged the route. He drove the copies toward the command post despite worsening weather because something about the missing building continued bothering his memory. By the time he arrived, several search teams had already suspended uphill movement until safer daylight conditions returned. The command supervisor compared the old map against current records and noticed the missing cabin had simply disappeared during later revisions. Nobody could explain why the structure vanished from official inspection schedules despite remaining marked on earlier property diagrams. Some volunteers wanted immediate confirmation, but another dangerous storm cell reached the valley before any new team could safely continue uphill. Search leaders reluctantly postponed that final location until sunrise because another rescue would only create additional victims. The decision frustrated everyone waiting inside the temporary command shelter while steady rain hammered the fabric roof through the remaining darkness. Nobody imagined that one forgotten structure might hold the explanation missing throughout every previous hour of searching. Morning arrived with gray skies and calmer winds, allowing two experienced volunteers to follow the faded logging road shown on the old map. Fallen branches blocked several sections, and thick brush almost concealed the narrow path from ordinary view. The hidden cabin finally appeared between tall evergreens, with weathered walls blending almost perfectly into the surrounding forest after years without maintenance. One shutter hung loose while the front porch leaned slightly toward damp ground covered with pine needles. The volunteers expected another empty building because every nearby structure had already produced nothing useful during the overnight operation. Instead, they noticed recent mud across the wooden steps and fresh scrape marks near the locked entrance. They announced their discovery through the radio before carefully forcing the swollen front door open with standard rescue equipment already carried. Inside, they found Nolan unconscious but breathing beside an overturned storage shelf covered with scattered emergency supplies. Paramedics reached the cabin quickly after receiving confirmed coordinates and transported Nolan toward a regional hospital once his condition stabilized. Doctors later determined he suffered a serious head injury after shelving collapsed during a sudden fall inside the building. That discovery solved only part of the mystery because several strange details still refused simple explanation according to later witness interviews. Nolan had apparently entered the forgotten cabin willingly, although inspection schedules never required visiting that isolated structure anymore. After regaining consciousness, he remembered hearing repeated banging while checking another nearby cabin shortly before heavy rain intensified across the ridge. Believing another worker needed help, he followed the distant sound through thick trees until reaching the hidden building. He unlocked the old door using a master maintenance key that surprisingly still matched the neglected lock despite decades without official use. Moments after stepping inside, weakened shelving collapsed and struck his shoulder before another beam hit his head. His radio broke beneath falling debris and lost battery power during the impact, preventing any emergency call before unconsciousness followed quickly afterward. Rain outside masked weaker sounds, making rescue almost impossible from nearby trails during the violent overnight storm. Investigators examined the damaged cabin carefully and discovered several maintenance tags dated 2003 still attached beneath broken shelving. Those records confirmed occasional emergency supply inspections continued quietly years after official property maps removed the building completely. Further review uncovered a simple administrative mistake during digital record transfers completed around 2008 after management software changed. One property identification number accidentally merged with another location, causing the forgotten cabin to disappear from active databases. Nobody noticed the missing structure because inspection responsibilities shifted between different departments over several budget reductions and staffing changes. Paper files preserved the original location, but digital maps slowly became accepted as complete without independent verification. Archived emails showed employees occasionally mentioning an old storage building, although nobody questioned why official maps lacked that specific location. Each reference appeared too vague for anyone recognizing the larger pattern hiding inside scattered administrative records. Search coordinators later updated training procedures requiring volunteers to compare digital information with historical property files during remote operations. They also introduced mandatory reviews involving retired staff because older employees often remembered forgotten locations unavailable inside modern databases. The retired groundskeeper never described himself as a hero because he believed simple memory happened to fill an unfortunate administrative gap. He insisted many longtime workers carried valuable knowledge impossible to replace with newer computer systems alone. Nolan recovered slowly over several months before returning to lighter forestry duties after doctors approved limited outdoor responsibilities. He rarely discussed the accident except when speaking privately with newer maintenance workers during seasonal training sessions. Whenever someone asked why he still carried printed maps inside every vehicle, he answered with the same quiet explanation each time. Paper never forgot buildings, simply because someone entered the wrong information years earlier inside a computer. The mountain recreation area remained peaceful after those events, and visitors rarely noticed one repaired cabin hidden beyond the old logging road. New signs marked every remaining structure, while updated records included every forgotten building without exception. Search reports eventually closed the case with no suspicious findings beyond the administrative failures that delayed the final discovery until morning. Even so, many volunteers admitted the outcome stayed with them long after the paperwork disappeared into storage. The forgotten cabin never became famous beyond local conversations because nothing supernatural had happened inside those weathered wooden walls. Yet, one overlooked entry on an aging property map nearly kept a wounded caretaker hidden until another day completely passed. Years later, experienced rescue volunteers still shared the story during training because careful records sometimes mattered as much as courage itself. Sunrise revealed the cabin at last, but simple attention might have revealed it long before darkness ever settled.